Eric, this is going to be one of them episodes.
It is.
When they say them changing, because so some people, not that those who listen to the cult will say this, but some people on the periphery might say, hey, just get to the point. Give me the summary, okay? Overtraining, overreaching, what's going on? So, Eric, allow me to synthesize the latest research because this is coming hot off the presses. I don't know when this episode will be released. We are not masters of our own fates here at Iron Culture. We are beholden to the cult. But this, correct me if I'm wrong, there is, from the latest, it'd be, December 1st, monthly application strength sports, mass. An article coming out written by HH, Hunk Helms. Is this correct?
Yeah, that's my pen name, HH.
Pen name.
So you'll see Eric Helms on it, but just know that in spirit it's HH. Yeah.
And the short summary about, overreaching, overtraining, low energy availability is simply this, that overtraining doesn't exist. You're just weak. And I mean mentally weak. I don't mean physically because, of course, that's a given. Financially, probably insecure, unable to provide for your family. And most of all, the fate that has befallen you is directly your own damn fault. So the next time you bring up this myth, just think about your fate and how every action you've made up until this point in time has directly led to it. And that's basically, it ties in neatly to kind of our economic theories that we have, the philosophies that we have, social philosophies, everything else, Yeah.
Extreme ownership goes both ways. You don't just get to claim your success. If you've ever had anything that didn't go your way, like if you were asleep in the middle of the night and a meteor goes through your roof and kills your wife, that was your fault.
Right.
That's what
you chose to sleep there, Eric. Let's think about it, though. You did choose to sleep there, right? You said...
Why were you sleeping when your competition was out training?
Yeah.
You would have seen it,
Yeah.
and if your training was good enough, instead of you bitching about being overtraining, you could have deflected that meteor.
It's true.
And then you could have written a book and sold an ebook about how to deflect meteors with your hands. You know what? That's what I would have done.
Eric, they're not about the grind,
anyway.
bro. They're not about the grind. They really aren't. It shows in their face.
Clearly. So, the funny thing is we're being incredibly facetious.
Yep.
But something that is not facetious, that has actually been repeated so much, and I actually don't know where this quote originally came from, but there is no such thing as overtraining, only undereating. Mm-hmm. That's definitely been something that's been repeated a lot. Yep. And yeah, I think it's a useful framing so we can have a discussion about what the hell are you talking about? And I had a few thoughts about this as I was writing for Mass this month, and I've started to realize maybe where that actually came from, because it's a uniquely lifter mentality. Like, it's not something that you get in other circles of like sports, endurance athletes pretty much agree that there is such a thing as overtraining, So I think part of the issue is, and probably where we should start, is that the term overtraining is not like a solid definition. When people say overtraining, it's a very different thing than when you actually write, say, overtraining syndrome in a sports science article that gets published. And I think that disconnect is why there is still a lot of confusion on this topic. So I'm gonna pitch it back to you as a man who has his finger on the pulse, which it always confuses me how often you get the opportunity to have your finger on the pulse of people. Maybe you're hanging out with Danny Lennon too often. Yeah. You never let go. Yeah, there you go. So anyway, you got the finger on the pulse of the cult. When people say overtraining, in what context does it often come up, and what do you think they're asking, or what do you think they mean? That's my question to you.
100%, Eric. I think when people say overtraining, what they're really probably describing is not even overreaching, like a functional or non-functional, where they're going through a cycle in the programming where it's getting a little bit tough. What they mean is that their performance, comparative to what it was before in a very short term, so week to week, or maybe even session to session, is suffering. And they don't feel that they could perform at the same level that they've come to expect from themselves. And so when they say, oh, I'm overtrained, it actually really is describing a very short phenomenon that occurs like within like a session. Like they just had they went hard in one session and suddenly, oh, guess what? 48 hours later, you can't repeat that session where you went to like 80% at RPE 9. Dog, I'm overtrained. So I think that's when people tend to use overtraining, or they say that phrase, they're describing simply recovering from potentially a tough session. There are some people, I will say some people, but it's far less common because I think strength coaches have rallied against like overtraining in the context of like strength athletes. Some people I have seen, Eric, but again, not as prevalent anymore, will tend to try and use it when they're in a particularly intense block of training preparing for a specific goal. So that's more analogous maybe to like a powerlifting preparing for a meet. And week after week, they're kind of getting that high debt fatigue that's occurring with them as they continue to train. Performance continues to suffer for a few weeks, and they're really just trying to get past that point to get the rebound. But what they're describing is their current state of existence and their current performance within that comparative structure.
Yeah, I would agree completely. I typically hear it like very much in line with what you said, as in basically two ways. One is someone, reaches out of a sense of frustration, sometimes just fear. Sometimes they're not even actually seeing performance go down, which is the wild one to me. But I'll talk about what most of the time it is things aren't going well, whether I'm either plateaued or, maybe even acutely getting a little bit worse, or I just feel like crap. And I am wondering if it's because I'm doing too much. Yeah. Am I overtraining? So it's X, Y, and Z is happening. Am I overtraining? Or you get the thing like, hey, I'm doing X number of sets, or I'm training to like some aspect about the program. Is that overtraining? Almost like there's kind of some objective for every one amount that would be overtraining. And again, that latter one sometimes comes before they've even like started the program. Like, would 12 sets on this exercise be overtraining? So it's oftentimes just code for question, am I doing too much, and is that why things aren't going well? And I will actually give a little bit of credence. Overtraining syndrome, for reasons that we'll discuss, is probably not a concern of lifters. So simply asking the question of, am I maybe not getting things right and I'm erring on the side of doing too much, it actually is the valid question. Yeah. But I think when you're speaking to people who walk in evidence-based or research or sports science, let's say informed sectors, who maybe don't understand the disconnect between the colloquial and the actual definition of overtraining, you can get people talking across each other, or you can get these statements from some people in the evidence-based community like, overtraining is not a concern for lifters. And you're probably thinking like, so I can just keep doing more volume, and no, that's not it, right? So I think that's one. And then the other one I would say is the correct usage of the overreaching terminology, but in a little bit narrow sense. They're actually talking about functional overreaching, like, I'm overreaching in this block, and then I'm going to taper, and then I'm going to compete, right? And that's kind of built into like the more standard knowledge block periodization model. And often that comes with the understanding of, I'm going to see a short-term decrement in performance, and I'm going to feel worse, and I'm going to be kind of holding on and white knuckling it. But then, once I make it to the point where the volume starts coming down, maybe the loads start coming down as well, or what have you, quick plug of our taper episode with Hayden Pritchard, then I'm going to come back and I'm going to be better than I even was before that overreaching period. So that's what most people understand when we talk about overtraining or overreaching. However, the actual consensus definition of overtraining syndrome, non-functional overreaching, and functional overreaching is basically understanding it on a continuum that is largely differentiated purely by the time course of how long, the key determinant of overreaching, overtraining, how long is your performance plateaued or actually declining. And it does need to be a decline if we're talking about overtraining. And really, that's the only key characteristic that everyone agrees upon. And there are all these secondary symptoms that you could say that affect a lot of different, physiological and psychological outcomes, but they're not necessary to that key determinant of the definition. So if we go back to 2013, there's a publication with a lot of different authors on it who are well known in this area, but the lead author is Musin. So it's Musin and colleagues, 2013, and it is a joint consensus statement between the European College of Sports Medicine and the American College of Sports Medicine. And it's specifically the joint statement on how to prevent, diagnose, and treat overtraining syndrome. So definitely check that out. That's Musin et al. 2013. And it basically, I'm going to summarize the definitions. And I think, like I said, it's best to think of it on a continuum. So if we have normal overloading training, what that results in is a suppression of performance that lasts basically until the next session, or probably in a context of, say, bodybuilding or powerlifting, the next session where you train the same qualities, if you will, right? That's normal. Like, we know that if I just did a 5x5 hard day on squats, the sixth set will be worse than the first or second, right? Performance will have gone down. I have generated acute fatigue. That needs to happen. Like, if there's no overload, there's no adaptation, right? The next step on that continuum towards overtraining syndrome, which is on the far end, would be functional overreaching. This is where, instead of it just lasting until the next session, or say like a microcycle or something that we might quote unquote expect, now we're talking about weeks of time. And importantly, with functional overreaching, when that overreaching phase is over, performance rebounds and actually goes above baseline. So hence it being functional. It means like, hey, we gambled and it paid off. So the two key determinants are that it is weeks, okay, and that performance comes back. Non-functional overreaching is weeks to months, and performance does not come back. So it either stays depressed, or it plateaus, or it comes back, but not above where it was previously. You recover from the status of overreaching that lasted at least multiple weeks, and you didn't gain anything from it. So that kind of sucks. And that is something I think a lot of lifters have experienced. We put, maybe you did Smolov and all you came away with it was a really janky knee, but if you look at it, like maybe in week, like halfway through the program, your squat was up and then it started to come down. And then when you finish the whole thing, you look back and you're like, before I started Smolov, I could squat 480. After I did Smolov, I'm squatting 480. That sucks, So that would be non-functional overreaching, right? You saw a depression in performance and it didn't come back, even though you sorted that under recovery. Full-blown overtraining syndrome is when we're talking about multiple months or longer of having a decline in performance that does not resolve itself even when you dissipate that fatigue. So of course, you don't stay all the way at the bottom of that pit, but you don't get back above to where you started. It really was just at best hitting pause on your performance for the length of time that you had overtraining syndrome. Additionally, overtraining syndrome can, but doesn't necessarily, although it often does, comes with a host of other side effects. Probably the most common are things like a loss of motivation, poor mood state, frustration, anger. Some of the psychological effects, to my knowledge, are the ones that are most consistently expressed in the literature. But you also see changes in like the HPA and HPG axis. So you see changes in like the testosterone cortisol ratio. You can see disrupted sleep. You can see suppressions of testosterone. You can see changes in LH. You can see a lot of changes. So there's a bunch of different symptoms that can come as secondary signs of overtraining. And unfortunately, even though they're so prevalent and they've been measured so many times in research, they're not consistent enough that they are actually part of that diagnosis. So the diagnosis really does simply come down to the length of time that performance is depressed and whether it comes back up to or above or not baseline. But people have observed, like, we're talking like hematological and biochemical markers that are off, adrenocortical hormones that are out of whack, quote unquote. That's not a really specific terminology, but negative impacts on immune function. So athletes who are overreaching or overtrained, they're more likely to get injured. They're more likely to see themselves come down with a common cold or upper respiratory tract infection. You also see changes in HRV, so heart rate variability. You can see negative impacts on RMR, metabolic markers, changes in appetite, also perceived difficulty of even the same training loads, things like that. You'll also see decreases in protein synthesis, decreases in glycogen synthesis, and of course, other types of performance that aren't related to lifting get negatively affected as well in other athletes, like endurance, speed, power, reaction time, change of direction, and even judgment. So like in a sport where you're reacting to another athlete or you have to make tactical decisions on the fly, you can see objective markers for the quality of those judgments even going down with overtraining syndrome. But again, while those are very common, they're not ubiquitous. they're not consistent on which you experience, and the severity and the magnitude are not consistent. The only thing that really is consistent is the decrements in performance. And I think there are very few lifters who will say that, yeah, I think I've experienced overtraining syndrome, when there aren't other potential causes, which we can get to. But I'm gonna put a pin in it right there, Omar, and say, do you think that maybe the technical definitions differ a good degree with what people mean when they say overtraining?
Eric, just a little bit, because let me give you a personal anecdote, which is an unequivocal fact of what transpired. There I was doing curls, as one is wont to do on a late Friday night session, thinking about their homies. And I couldn't remember for the life of me how many sets I had done. Was it 2 or was it 3? Of course, I was not about to shortchange myself, my gains, so I did an extra set. And that's when I checked the logbook. And to my horror, I had already done 3 sets. I did 4 sets of 10 instead of 3 sets of 10. For probably...
So you have experienced overtraining syndrome?
Eric, probably for the next 6 months afterwards, I had adrenal fatigue, just... confidence is like,
that's crazy, because that's not even real, bro.
Well, you know what's funny? I felt it though. Like I felt it. My libido had tanked for 6 months straight. The only thing that revitalized it was when you sent me a DM. 6 months afterwards.
Oh, wow.
I don't think there were. I'm not sure. One, you know, as someone who is a little bit skeptical, what can you say? What can you say? Now, Eric, to be serious for a second though, I do have a question. Just because I think overtraining, people hear that and immediately they're realizing, you know what? Yeah, maybe I use this word incorrectly. I'm trying to describe something that I personally feel is phenomenal. I want to ask you that the question as it relates then to overreaching, functional, non-functional, that probably some people that have been in blocks, as you said, a small of, is it also potentially a question for them when they're trying to define baseline performance, that the error is in defining baseline performance? And what I mean is that I think all too often people will define their baseline performance as actually an aberration in their average performance. Like, oh, your best squat ever, like 520, or like, Eric, your best triple, like 460. That's your baseline to how you view yourself. That was you, all possible scenarios coalescing to produce the best possible performance. And the fact that you can't get back to that when you're not following a properly regimented, structured plan isn't overreaching once again. And I'm not trying to dog anyone that experiences these symptoms, that experiences, either like fatigue session to session. I'm merely saying, what factor do you think establishing a true baseline performance goes into the expectation one has with regards to their training? Because you said baseline performance, and like we understand that, but you know what I mean? Like, what's your baseline? What are you using as your baseline, dog?
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to, like, when you look at studies on this, they have to, objectively define it as, what was their normal rate of increase over time? Like, you look at these surveys of athletes, what symptoms did they present with, the secondary symptoms, what did their performance track look like? And they have to do it retrospectively and look back at a large period of time. So, and even more so, I think it's important to mention, like, a trainer is not supposed to be diagnosing overtraining syndrome. Right. It's actually like a sports medicine doctor in a professional sports or collegiate sports kind of facility that is doing this, or at least an athletic trainer, or typically someone who's trained in health. And the reason is because it is an exclusionary diagnosis. What that means is that you have to rule out all other potential causes that could lead to performance being down for multiple months at a time, and that may or may not be leading to these secondary symptoms, before you can go, you know what, we've ruled out everything else that could cause this, so therefore what remains, by deductive reasoning, is overtraining. And I think that's very different from just going, okay, I met that criteria. I've been seeing this decrement in performance for months, so therefore it's overtraining. Well, what if you got an injury? Is an injury overtraining? No. And we'll actually talk about that. And is, let's say and this we'll spend a lot more time on it, but just I'm going to plant the seed. If you have been dieting hardcore and on like a crash diet or very low energy availability approach, or you've gotten extremely lean and you're experiencing some of these symptoms that I described of overtraining, which overlap a ton with the symptoms of low energy availability, and your performance has gone down, no. That's not overtraining, because nutritional deficiencies and even macronutrient and micronutrient deficiencies and energy total intake deficiencies have to be ruled out as a potential cause before you can get this overtraining syndrome diagnosis. So that's one thing I think we need to be clear on where some of these, where many people, I would say, like you hinted at, and not to dog on them by any means, might misattribute their experience to overtraining. But yeah, just like you said, a huge part of it is, one, expectations. I think because of a lot of the way that fitness is marketed, people have unrealistic expectations. So they can even frame, like I mentioned earlier, which is kind of wild to me now, which is to some degree like an experience bias. Like, I'm not gaining 5 pounds per week on a lift, therefore I'm not making progress. And it's like, well, gaining 5 pounds on a lift per month is adding 60 pounds per year to your lift. I would love that to happen. That's insane, at a certain level. Yep. But it's, basically not knowing what is a realistic rate of progress, I think, is a big one, and then how that's framed internally. But the other one is absolutely yes. And we talked about this actually not too long ago on our last duo episode, where when you don't necessarily have a high degree of self-efficacy, right? And when you don't have a whole lot of self-belief, you think your achievements are impermanent. So if you did everything in your power, busted your ass, you everything, crossed your T's, dotted your I's, nutrition, training, sleep, coach, supplements, the whole 9 yards, and you're able to squat 340, you don't feel like I really squatted 340. You worry, maybe I can't keep that. And that can go for fat loss, like the contest prep competitor, or even just anyone who lost, say, 20 or 30 pounds. They start to regain 5 pounds, and that is an extremely scary process because it makes them think like, oh, I knew it. I was a fraud. I wasn't actually able to accomplish that. It was just me kind of getting lucky, quote unquote. And now I'm going to slide back to where I was. And that's how, cyclical disordered eating patterns can develop, because someone is, gripping out of a sense of fear to try to hold on to what they had, or, training in really kind of aberrant ways where you're going on and off these hardcore training programs. Do I need to deload or do I need to train hardcore? I shouldn't deload, I'm afraid, because you don't think 340 was really you, right? So I think for people in that position, they're constantly pushing the bar to whatever the best they've ever achieved is. They're not looking at their average performance. They're not considering what you and I have talked about before. What is my day-to-day 1 rep minimum and my 1 rep maximum? What's my normal band of performance? How do I know what normal is? And they have this fear-based elevation of my, I cut depth a little bit. The spotter touched the bar. I was listening to Rage Against the Machine, and I took about 900 milligrams of caffeine, and that's what I squatted after a peaking block and a taper. That's what I should be able to squat on any given day. Yep. That's my identity. Yep. So 100%, they may have very unrealistic expectations combined with this skewed perception on what their baseline is. And I think that absolutely contributes to a lot of those posts, DMs, questions that you and I get. And I've had that interaction many times with clients. Yep. As a coach, needing to point out to them, okay, let's objectively look at the rate of weight loss we've had. Like you're focused on today's scale weight, or let's objectively look at the performance lack of improvement you've had. Here's the rate, and oftentimes, sometimes people can be shown this data, and then they can start to rationalize it and realize it and kind of reshape the reality. But it's not easy. We've talked many times about the struggle of the intermediate phase, where people's knee-jerk reaction is just to try to repeat what they did as a novice, because that's what they associated with the rate of progress that they really enjoyed. So I think that's something we all struggle with. We've talked about that a lot, but 100% that is part of it. But another thing is that we just have a misunderstanding of what overtraining is.
Eric, so well said. So as captains of our own fate, understanding that the meteor was our own damn fault, let's talk about that very interesting phrase you used, low energy availability, because I understand you did a review that's coming out. I'm saying hot off the presses. I imagine this is going to be for Cyber Monday. I don't know, like maybe November. So it's coming out in December. This is breaking news before mass even hits the shelves, the online proverbial shelves.
I don't know if that's true, because we're 2 weeks ahead.
Okay,
so
it's true. It'll
probably be coming out the first week of December. Or this episode, that is. And mass always comes out first. Every time, folks.
Every time.
On the first of the month. So, but it'll be close enough that you will be able to read some stuff about kind of this topic. But yeah, I think...
So the Rogue AI wins this one. Greg gets the dub here. Okay, I understand.
He wins them all. Even when we think we've won. It's really just the algorithm that is Greg going, you know what, I need to let the humans feel an emotional win so that I can operate in secret more actually winning.
Yeah.
So
it's so weird how he always says, instead of human, he says human. I don't know why. It's just like a little weird, cute quirk that no one tends to notice, but it is what it is. I do have then the question, Eric, to continue this conversation, because we're talking about actual overtraining, endurance athletes, a variety of different sports. And then you use this phrase, low energy availability, and its relationship.
Actually,
talk to me.
You mentioned endurance athletes.
Yeah.
Can we talk about that a little bit?
Unfortunately,
we've unfortunately we've opened Pandora's box. It's not closing. All right. The ASICs are out of the box. All right. And we've unfortunately found out that we have to even open our arms to endurance athletes if, and it's this big if, because not all of them do it, and shame on them, if they lift, they're part of the cult, unfortunately. And apparently there's a lot of people who want to both lift weights and run, or cycle or swim, which you know what? I'm trying to move past tolerance to actual acceptance, and just I am asking you to accept me as I make that process visible to the cult.
Well, Eric,
and I'm gonna do something. I'm gonna try to help some people out here. Do you want to say something on that?
Just one real quick final thing. As the saying goes, we said endurance, some people want to combine it with lifting, some people like chocolate, some people like vanilla, and some people want to watch the world burn. And that's what we have here. I even saw my friend Alan Thrall. Did you?
Some people like chocolate, some people like to eat shit.
yeah. And to them, they can't tell the difference. And that is endurance. No.
Yeah, so we just have to respect that.
So I'll say this. I saw Alan. Did you see it on Instagram? Where my boy, Mr. Strongman, he's looking lean, he's looking hunky, but he bought a pair of actual running Nike Pegasus. We're not endorsed by the corporate cabals, but he like just posted the shoes, like, can't wait to run more. I was like, what? Eric? Is it going to be just you and I left in the end?
The closest I've ever gotten to that, and in sense I've seen the light, because I did actually run track in high school, was I had to do a truck pull in 2019 as part of a strongman, exhibition competition. It wasn't an exhibition, but it wasn't a full 4 event or 5 event meet, but it was 2 things. And I did get specific shoes to move my feet very quickly, but I was actually attached to a tractor. And more importantly, the shoes we had to get are climbing shoes that are really, really small, and they hurt tremendously. So they have this really good element of suffering. I don't even have to run to be in pain. And so I feel like I was still justified. I was pulling an object. Right. It did last as long as it could have, until I couldn't move it any longer. And that wasn't that long, because it was very heavy and hard to pull. I did my best. But the point is that's the closest I've ever gotten to buying running shoes and the recent history. I've done cardio. Yeah. Don't get me wrong. That's different. Okay. I'm trying to get shredded.
Eric.
Yeah. 100%.
Eric, it's top down. So sorry, you were saying endurance athletes, these mythical figures.
Yes. Okay. So overtraining syndrome. It seemed to be caused by just very excessive training loads. So when the overload is so excessive that you actually can't adapt to it, long term, that can result in overtraining syndrome. So you're just far exceeding your adaptive capacities. Now, this is something that, like I said and hinted at, is extremely rare, full-blown overtraining syndrome in lifters. And you might be going, why? Well, ultimately, training load, I'm kind of putting this, or training stress, it's a big picture concept that is kind of the addition or the multiplication, if you will, of intensity and volume. And because intensity in resistance training, and we got to take ourselves outside of the world of resistance training, right? We're almost like, we think light loads are, say, 50% of 1 RM or less than 60% of 1 RM. But that's still an extremely heavy weight if we think of it in terms of the spectrum from body weight up to a 1 RM of like any contraction, right? That you might be moving something, right? So your 60% of 1 RM, that's 20 reps. That's only going to last like a minute, okay? At most, before you physically cannot keep moving. If I asked you to do body weight squats, now we're looking at many more minutes. And if I asked you to reduce the depth that you're going with those squats and maybe just do it on one leg and keep moving forward, now we're talking about you can do that for 26 miles and hours and hours and hours, okay? So the volumes that endurance athletes can accrue, how much they can accumulate, makes resistance training just pale in comparison. So the absolute training loads are pretty much capped by how much the training stress that you can induce on your body is actually limited because we're already on the load or intensity spectrum so far on the heavy side of things. So endurance training and team sport athletes, and when people are doing concurrent training, cardio plus lifting plus, other forms of training like speed, power, team sport athletes, they're the ones who actually are often relatively observed to have overtraining syndrome. But even then, it's actually pretty rare. So there was a nice study that was done in 2019. The lead author's name, this is amazing, I'm probably mispronouncing it. I'm just going to put that up front because I do think they're from Belgium, but it's spelled Buyse. I want to say Busey, but I'm saying it's probably not Busey, like Gary Busey, one of the best actors out there. But anyway, it's Buyse and colleagues, 2019, and it is improving the diagnosis of non-functional overreaching and overtraining syndrome. And they looked at like hundreds of endurance athletes who were experiencing secondary symptoms and a decrease in performance, right? So we're thinking, they've met the diagnostic criteria for overtraining syndrome. And they actually then went through the full diagnosis, the exclusionary process of trying to eliminate all other possible causes. And guess how many of them actually had full-blown overtraining syndrome? Only 15% of them. So there's a lot of things that can lead to this. And 15% is not a small number. Like that's definitely small, but it is a sizable proportion of athletes, endurance athletes, who need to consider, maybe this is due to just too excessive training load and not something else. Now, here's what's wild. If we talk about resistance training, I am not aware of there ever being a diagnosis of overtraining syndrome in the literature to date, despite some absolutely ludicrous protocols. Okay? So a really good review, and I think I might have referenced it previously on Iron Culture. I can't remember. We talk about so much, but anyway, 2020 systematic review. So we're talking only missing like the last year and a half or so of published data by Grandow and colleagues, and it's titled "Overtraining and Resistance Exercise: An Exploratory Systematic Review and Methodological Appraisal of the Literature." Okay, so what they did was they reviewed 22 studies that met the inclusion criteria. And they needed to, and again, these are experimental studies. So in these 22 studies, the authors attempted to induce overreaching or overtraining, successfully or not. And then they looked at the outcomes, the symptoms, and reported what happened compared to the quote unquote control group or the quote unquote normal training group. And in 10 of those 22 studies, nearly half, performance didn't even go down. So at best, it plateaued. So right there, we can eliminate 10 of these 22 studies as saying they didn't overtrain. Now, what's wild is when you look at what are these overtraining protocols. So there was a bunch of studies done by Fry and colleagues back in the 90s. Here's the protocol that they would often use. Work up to a 1 RM on squats. Sweet. Do that 10 more times. Come back a couple days later, do it again. That was the overtraining protocol.
And it's true, Eric, before we go on, because this is a study, when we say work up to a true 1 rep max, is it also implied that maybe you work up until you fail? So it's like it's a max maybe until...
That certainly would probably happen in a number of instances because they have a protocol there for the 10 back off 1 RMs where if they miss it, they reduce the load by 4.5 kilograms, 10 pounds. This is an American study. And you try again. So on each one of those 10 back off sets, it's the heaviest load they could do, or at least the closest they can get with 10 pound increments to what they could physically squat. And then they go, sweet, we'll see you in 72 hours. We're going to do it again.
Yeah. No, that's insane.
That's the overtraining protocol. Yeah. And that didn't even result in overtraining syndrome. And I'll explain to you why. Here's another one. This one is even wilder. So Margonis and colleagues, okay, they actually put out the whole thing. It wasn't just specifically squats. That's kind of like a very reductionist look at overtraining. They had a full body weight training program. The baseline quote unquote training that they were like habituated to was 3 days per week with what we would probably describe as moderate volumes with primarily free weight compound exercises in like the 8 to 12 RM range. Okay. The next 3 weeks after that, they increased volume load fourfold. So, and wait for it, increased load. So now they're going from 8 to 12 to like say 6 to 8 RM, and they trained closer to failure. Okay. And they increased frequency. So they added a day of training to accommodate this fourfold increase in volume load. Not done. The 3 weeks immediately following that, no deloads between these blocks, they increase baseline volume 7-fold. Okay? So let's say you're doing, 10 sets per muscle group. No worries, 70 sets per muscle group. And again, they went from an additional day of training to additional 2 days of training to accommodate. So they're training every single day except for one, training closer to failure. And load goes up to the 4 to 6 rep range. And that's what they did to induce overtraining. Now, so we've got a couple important points to make here. One, when someone gets injured in these studies, they sort of don't get counted. They have to withdraw, so their data isn't fully included. And a specific point that some authors have pointed out is that an injury is not the same thing as overtraining. Now, in terms of the functional outcomes, it sort of is. As far as if you theoretically could have trained more, but you got injured, does that mean you should have trained more, or you could have done? No, you obviously that if the injury was due to overuse and repeated contractions and too much work, that was too much. So what this starts to show us is that strength, performance in the weight room is one of the very last qualities of physiology and human performance that is negatively affected by excessive training stress. But it doesn't necessarily indicate that you weren't doing far too much. Like if your testosterone's in the toilet, you're on the brink of injury, you're not improving performance, but you can barely maintain your 1RM, you're still doing too much. Maybe 7-fold too much, But actually, to be fair, so I mentioned 10 of these studies didn't even observe a reduction in performance, okay? 12 of them they did, but a good handful of those, there was no follow-up. So in 4 of these remaining 12 studies, they saw performance decline, but then didn't follow up over time. And again, what is the key determinant of whether something is overtraining syndrome or non-functional overreaching? Time. So you have to follow up at least multiple months afterwards to see, is performance still down by the thing we did to you? Because that's what overtraining syndrome would be. In fact, the longest study was 8 weeks. So that's only, you could maybe call that, it's slightly less than 2 months, right? So we've never sufficiently observed resistance trained athletes long enough to actually get an overtraining diagnosis. The worst thing we've ever seen is non-functional overreaching in the literature. And I will say in my anecdotal experience, I've never, of course, gone through a true diagnosis of whether or not someone is overtraining. I've not seen overtraining syndrome that I could confidently isolate to purely just doing that training. So it is actually true that I've never seen a case, and there's never been a recorded case that I'm aware of, there may be one out there, in fact, I'd be surprised if there wasn't, of actual overtraining syndrome purely from resistance training. So in some way, the bros are kind of right, but I don't think they actually were using the definition of overtraining syndrome when they were saying that to know that they were right. It requires some kind of revisionist history of their own statement for that to be the case. So yeah, man, overtraining. It's rare even in endurance athletes, and it's pretty much unheard of in actual resistance trained athletes if we're talking full-blown overtraining syndrome.
Eric, let's just pause for a second. I do love the concept, in science. You want to try and prove or test, is a thing, right? Okay, so this concept of overtraining, one, how do we define it? And all these other things. It's also just wild to me where you said that protocol, in particular, both of them, so the 1 rep max, because as you alluded to in basically many studies, just to guarantee efforts there, it's not like a gym 1 rep max, where someone hits it and could they hit more, could they not hit more? Maybe they're making them go all the way, to failure and then repeat it 10 times. Lovely. But that 7 times, so you're talking whatever, 70 sets, just to try and observe what's going on here. And then the fact that people, once again, when it comes to, a decrease in performance or a time course for a decrease in performance, a look at maybe a redefinition for people where I think to your point, you hit the nail on the head already, in minute 20, that a lot of people have that fear that they're not always the guy or girl, at the top of their performance. And that's the thing that they're struggling with. But nonetheless, the interesting conversation to be had, because endurance athletes, we take a look at our dear friend Mike Zoros, where you and I both scoffed at him, where we thought, okay, resistance training, you love it, 8, 10, 12, how many hours can you dedicate to this craft? Just in a raw hour, not effort, but total amount of time commitment. At minimum for endurance athletes, we're talking 10 hours of road work, 15, 20, 25 hours of road work. Resistance training, I was talking actually, Eric, real quickly to a wrestler and the wrestling protocol being like a collegiate wrestler is insane. Like any athletic endeavor, and I am not trying to downplay resistance training, like what we do and what we love, but just like I love how baked in within resistance training certain things are for almost I describe longevity. Like you're a bodybuilder and you love the sport. Like Eric, you love bodybuilding. Guess what, man? After hour 10, I'm making up this like barrier here. Like you're really not going to get any more gains from training more. So there's a hard rate limit of how much you could do this thing. And even if you went, as you said, like the 70 cents all the way out there, like there's baked into lifting kind of like some safety measures inherent within it. Then in other sports endeavors, if we're at least talking potentially overreaching, like some of the collegiate wrestlers, if you take a look at their hours, man, that they invest into, plus what you're going to talk about, like low energy availability, trying to make weight, and all these other things like coming together, that's some real shit right here. As I joked about doing that one extra set, like, oh, it's a 4x10. Guess my training for the next few weeks is going to be completely off. I exceeded my MRV. There we go, bros. It's going to be insane. So I think perspective can always be something sobering for the average listener, maybe.
Yeah, and like even if you look at like competitive strength athletes, so we know that weightlifters do a lot more training days and hours because it's so skill dependent than say your average, bro who's interested in getting stronger on the big three that are far less skill demanding, or just putting in a ton of hours to get as yacked as possible. Like if we go like to the one standard deviation up on how much do, say, weightlifters train per week, we start to reach around the average, or maybe one standard deviation down on triathletes in terms of hours. But let's not forget that the most common piece of weightlifting equipment in a weightlifting gym are folding chairs, right?
Yeah,
so
for real.
It's Alico bars and folding chairs. So when a triathlete says, I'm training 10 hours a week, that's 10 hours of moving.
Very good
When
point.
a weightlifter says I'm training 10 hours per week, that's 1 hour of lifting and 9 hours of recovery. Yeah. And I'm not at all exaggerating. That's a legitimate work to rest ratio. Like if you think about it, a triple on snatches is going to take you 10 to 15 seconds. And then you're going to rest 3 minutes. Right? Yeah. Even when you start doing like lifting for CrossFit, we start to see pretty big work to rest ratios when you compare it to an endurance training, right? Which is almost constant movement. Yeah. So it is just a fundamentally capped activity when we're talking about lifting weights that really limits how much volume you can do. And so I think for that reason, overtraining syndrome is almost not the right question for lifting weights. Like there's a proposed term, mechanical overreaching, which is basically an overuse injury that doesn't quite rise to the level of an injury. Like you can still train around it. And we've all experienced this. Like we were talking off camera about how, like when I was out in Florida and I was trying to train like with a normal schedule, but I was also loading plates for a study 6 days a week in the lab, how I got such bad elbow tendonitis that I couldn't fully straighten my arm, so I had to do partials. I worked around it. Didn't quite raise to the level of an injury, if we wanted to use a technical definition, but it was actually creating this performance decrement. But it was lower than the amount of training I was doing was still lower than my theoretical systemic amount that I could recover from, or that should actually induce overtraining syndrome. So it's kind of this offshoot. So most of the time, what lifters deal with is non-functional overreaching or mechanical overtraining, if we want to call it that, or full-blown injury from doing too much before they can ever physically even possibly get to overtraining syndrome. Or what is actually much more common, and what I think is often results in a misdiagnosis of overtraining, is low energy availability. So we'll get to that now. And that's actually, there's a really cool paper that kind of got me thinking about all this, that was like, oh, I want to review that for Mass, which is actually the article that you were hinting at that's going to come out, and you can read a lot more about this, is by Stellingwerf and colleagues. And it is, the title kind of tells it all. Overtraining Syndrome and Relative Energy Deficiency in Sport. That's REDS, Shared Pathways, Symptoms, and Complexities. So what they did in this, it isn't quite a systematic review, but it's a really well done narrative review with some specific analyses, was they looked at, all right, all these symptoms, the secondary symptoms that we see of overtraining, how similar are those to REDS? And really briefly, for those who haven't listened to our previous episodes where we've talked a little bit about energy availability, this is actually different than just am I in a surplus or am I in a deficit, or am I eating at maintenance? Energy availability can actually be mathematically calculated as, okay, relative to your lean body mass, which should be relatively reflective of your physiological needs for those processes to continue to be healthy, right? And not suppressed to some degree. What is your energy intake after accounting for your exercise and activity factor? So like your exercise, activity, energy expenditure, if we take that away from your energy intake, and then if we report your energy intake relative to lean body mass, how much is that? And when you look at specific populations, you can often see a threshold cutoff to where you go below that and you start to see, for example, amenorrhea in women, or lower testosterone in men, or many of the same shared secondary symptoms that overtraining has. And those are the symptoms of REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport. So while this isn't a very accurate threshold cutoff for everyone, because of course non-exercise activity has some impact on expenditure, but a rough guideline is you don't want to go below 30 kcals per kilogram of lean mass as your energy availability. So again, you'd calculate that by going, okay, what's my energy intake? Sweet. Let me remove my average daily energy expenditure from exercise. Let me figure out my lean body mass, do the equation. If you're under that, and this may not be you, but on average, people with a kind of fixed and stable energy expenditure, when you're looking at a specific population, that is kind of a cutoff. Now, we've seen in high expenditure athletes who also have a lot of energy expenditure outside of their job, that value might be 35 or 40. We also know that the threshold where you start to see impacts on physiological function is typically higher in women than men. So while the woman might experience something being under 30, a guy in a similar lifestyle and activity stress with the same amount of not the same amount of lean body mass, but the same energy expenditure might not experience until under 25, right? And there may be, evolutionary reasons for that. Obviously, men are not the ones who have to carry a child to term and then feed them with their own body, while historically, men might have been the ones who needed to be out and hunting despite the fact that there was not food availability. So running around with shredded glutes, trying to hunt, basically what we're cosplaying at as bodybuilders today. So, so that may be why, the genes that got passed on are more resilient to low energy availability in men than they are in women. And of course, there's big individual differences. So what I don't want you to take away from this is, one, overtraining syndrome never happens in lifters, so I can do as much volume as I want. And two, there's a specific cutoff in energy intake, and anyone who's eating less than 30 kcals per kilogram of lean mass is doing it wrong, and I need to attack them and tell them about the hashtag science on the gram. So don't do those two things, please. But with those disclaimers out of the way, when you look at the symptoms of REDS, and relative energy deficiency in sport is like the full-blown syndrome that can come from chronic low energy availability. And much like overtraining syndrome, it is diagnosed by exclusion. So again, you can't do this just as an armchair trainer or even a trainer in person. You actually need to be a sports medicine doctor, athletic trainer, registered dietitian with a sports focus, etc., so that you can go, right, here's all the other potential medical causes that could be leading to these symptoms, like overtraining, for example. And that's not it. It is actually because you have been chronically undereating for a long period of time. Okay? So the reality is that every single symptom that is an overtraining syndrome, it is also in relative energy deficiency for sport. And the only difference is that REDS also, sometimes you have people reporting, they're not really reporting it, they are found to have lower bone mineral density or markers for poorer bone health. And, that's because, if you're exercising and you're eating sufficient, say, calcium, energy, and protein, you should see at least maintenance of bone growth. However, if you're pounding away, but you're eating insufficient food, like you'd expect in someone with relative energy deficiency, you might see bone health go down. And for those who have not heard of REDS or low energy availability, you've probably heard of the female athlete triad. And that's been something that's been researched for decades longer than REDS. REDS is kind of an umbrella term because it applies to both men and women. But when this was first and most often, these same symptoms, the REDS symptoms observed, they were in women diagnosed with the female athlete triad, which is the convergence of disordered eating, the effect, like I was saying before, on bone health, so poor bone health, and also menstrual cycle disruption. So, and also when when a woman has less estrogen production, that also has knock-on effects on their bone health. So anyway, the female athlete triad: disordered eating, menstrual cycle disruption, reductions in bone density, or a decline in bone health. That basically sits within the umbrella describing what specifically happens to women when they're experiencing low energy availability, with some specific caveats. Like, you can have low energy availability without necessarily having a disordered eating pattern. That's an important caveat. You may just be doing a really high volume of training and you don't actually increase your calories sufficiently. And that's where it gets confusing. So the issue is that in athletes with incredibly high energy expenditures, you can get to a place of low energy availability without actually decreasing your food intake. Right? So let's say you're a triathlete and you're building up your training for this big competition, and you get to the peak in your total training load, but you just can't get down any more than, say, 3,500 calories. It's just logistically infeasible. You're not someone who has that nice linear increase in appetite as you do more energy expenditure. So basically, let's say your energy intake stays flat and your energy expenditure goes up. You get into a state of low energy availability and you start to experience symptoms of overtraining, and you're going to think like, well, I trained more, I felt worse, and performance went down. I didn't eat any less. That's got to be overtraining syndrome. No, that actually could be REDS. So that's a really interesting thing there, where in the team sport world and the endurance athlete world, you can run into low energy availability for very different reasons than we see in the lifting, bodybuilding, powerlifting, and weight class restricted athletes, where on our end, energy expenditure only gets so high. Like you said, after you're training 10 hours a week, what are you really doing in the gym? You're probably just looking at Instagram or talking to Joe the trainer, right? What is happening here is that you're trying to stay lean. So you have, a really low energy intake, high step count. Maybe you're dieting for a bodybuilding show. Maybe you're trying to stay within striking distance of a weight class cutoff that might be a little too low, or maybe you're just being too aggressive about it. So for us in the lifting world, and this is funny because before I even really knew that the technical definition of REDS, or overtraining syndrome, I had remarked on this incorrectly, by the way, that we're experiencing this. We collectively in the lifting world might be experiencing symptoms of what we think is overtraining, perhaps due to REDS, but not because of high energy expenditure, because of just so simply chronic low energy availability. So anyway, I remember saying maybe the first time on a podcast in, say, 2014 or 2013, which is actually before the IOC statement, the International Olympic Committee, came out and said, hey, REDS is a thing. That was in 2014, and it was updated in 2018. So before that, and probably right around the time, but I hadn't read it yet, that this Musin article came out with the most up-to-date overtraining definition. Not that it's changed that much since the 80s when it first came out. I remember saying, I've never observed overtraining in any of my athletes or in the lifting world, except in contest prep competitors and in CrossFit competitors. And what I was probably observing was, well, let's talk about it. So contest prep, it's an obvious thing. Like, you're progressively and continually often reducing your energy intake, as you might also be progressively and often linearly increasing cardiovascular output, while you're maintaining resistance training and you're getting leaner. So obviously that's clear. Low energy availability is coming as a consequence of you trying to get shredded. And we all have talked about many times how hard contest prep is and the experience of going through contest prep. And yeah, that basically describes a lot of the symptoms we're talking about. Okay. They're all one and the same, and we get that. However, in CrossFit, and I don't want this to sound like I am trying to, lump all of, functional fitness into one little box, but especially around the time I said it, we're talking like 10 years ago when I first observed it. It wasn't the only time I said it. CrossFit was a little more unified. The boxes were a little more homogenous, and not always, and it really is very, very, very box dependent. So I want to give credit to all the people doing it right out there, that you would get exposed to CrossFit.
Indoctrinated.
And not only would you get exposed, yeah, exactly. You might even want to say that. And part of that is the diet, right? Yeah. I did not know many CrossFit interested, adjacent, or serious, CrossFit competitors, say 10 years ago, who weren't on some form of like the quote unquote paleo diet. And I do have to put quotes around it because it's really not that similar to what Paleolithic people actually ate. But this often comes from a reduction in carbohydrate intake and or a reduction in energy intake. The best form of it, I would say, is simply eating quote unquote real food, which I don't have an issue with. Like, hey, let's eat, more fruits and vegetables. Most boxes, that's just vegetables because fruits are somehow bad. I don't even know how that works. Definitely Paleolithic people ate fruit. Okay. But anyway, let's say best case scenario, in a box where they did expose you to changes to nutrition. And there's a lot of upsides to this. You're eating more protein, which is great. More whole foods, fewer processed foods. You increased your fruit and vegetable consumption, but you've also increased you've decreased energy density. So you're eating more weight of food, but less energy. Your carbohydrate intake may have gone down a little bit. Your fat intake goes down a little bit. Overall, energy intake goes down while you take up CrossFit. And what is CrossFit? It's lifting, but it also has aerobic and anaerobic components. And you know what? While they may be doing snatches and clean and jerks in CrossFit gyms, you know what they don't have that weightlifting gyms have? They don't have the foldable chairs. Because when you finish the snatch, you got to do some wall slams, or you got to do some kipping pull-ups, or you got to go on a run, or you got to jump on the assault bike, or you got to jump on the rower. So CrossFit is about how much volume can I accumulate in as short of a time period as possible, and sometimes a competitive environment, right? So it is about the density of training and total volume. So it includes lifting, but really what I think I was observing is this concurrent effect of lowered energy intake, probably due to, a good diet. Don't get me wrong. Like, I think in best case scenario, sometimes a not so good diet, really, like I said, box dependent while doing more exercise. And I don't think it also helps that, like, when you look at the CrossFit competitors at the highest level, of course, genetic selection, you're going to see some really lean people. And I think that influences, at least at the time, what should I look like if I am quote unquote part of the CrossFit tribe? And I know I'm giving a lot of caveats, but I just don't want to paint with too broad of a brush. There's a lot of CrossFit boxes that don't do it this way, that progressively, increase load over time. They're able to scale certain exercises for people so the WODs aren't too much. And they are also staying in their lane and giving good nutritional information and advice out there. But it's just that there was a time when that was not the case. And it certainly wasn't everyone, but it was a large enough component that it was an anecdote that I saw, and I think that was happening. Am I an asshole, Omar, or am I off base, or do you think I'm maybe not too unfairly characterizing how it was, say, 5-10 years ago?
Hunky Helms, you can never go wrong. And let me just say it. Come on, let's be real here. You are observing, by all accounts, as you would say, ostensibly, the exact same symptoms as you would observe in overtraining, but you are seeing low energy availability. I think it's also entirely accurate. Your description of early CrossFit, where, let's be frank, a beginning is a delicate thing, right? And so CrossFit was at its inception, and it was a top-down hierarchy where basically boxes were supposed to follow specific protocols, so training protocols and then nutrition protocols. I remember, so all the way back now, we're going 2009, 2010, with the popularization of, quote unquote, the Paleo Diet. I don't know if you remember this, Eric. Like, so one of the pictures like floating around one of the many proverbial smoking guns was a banana. Oh, you eat a modern banana. Do you know what bananas look like? 3,000, like all these just like neat little narratives. It's like, but it's this like Frankenstein jigsaw piece they're trying to put together, because the idea, like, the fit is humans. So we're going to do something humans have never done before. So this like functional fitness umbrella, taking a largely sedentary population, we're then going to try and give nutritional advice that is mimicking, but not actually mimicking, our paleo ancestors, which may or may not have been an optimal way to eat for them, and then also then specifically may or may not be optimal for their goals. And we're just going to see what happens. So yeah, people doing a high volume of lifting, as you said, low energy availability. And I did describe, I actually had, I called them dead souls. This is terrible. I actually wrote something, Eric, in 2009 or 10. It was a phase, because I remember, because Nikolai Gogol, I love the work. It's not related at all to what I'm describing, but I said dead souls. Well, we said the dead behind the eyes look was zombies. Like I would say, let's just say, I will say CrossFitters that were perpetually kind of training, and they were getting this huge debt, like fatigue debt from doing all the things they were doing, but their caloric intake was very low. I do have a question for you. So I think you're you're spot on, and I think you're actually being charitable in terms of trying to give those caveats, explaining why. I do think it was like the Wild West. Think of proto powerlifting, bro. Like in the 1980s with the old adages, like, you work up to the max, and then like once again you fail. you work back down. So it's more a beginning is a delicate thing than actually, insulting anything about CrossFit ideologies there at the inception. My question for you, however, that I do want to explore a little further when you're defining REDs and then low energy availability is you brought up something interesting that the question would pertain to this. It's not only the energy availability, but then it's also the nutritional composition, where you're talking about the specific ratio potentially of the macronutrients. Like, would there be a role, let's say, if someone was to do more endurance-based training or something that is pretty aerobically demanding of carbohydrates? I'm wondering about the role then of macronutrients as well as low energy availability. So occasionally, if you're on video, you got to see it. Yeah, this is basically it. Your plate should look like this. Okay. Eric, just estimate for me, describe what the plate is and estimate the amount of calories on that plate. How one should eat.
So just for the ones who are listening and not watching, I've put up posters that I've actually seen at multiple CrossFits that have a little nutrition thing. Unfortunately, the top is cut off, and the top is the most important part. And it actually shows a picture of basically a nuclear power plant. It literally looks just like it. And I'm like, and the best part though is that it's labeled Food Inc. It's like a factory. It's got two smokestacks, stuff coming out of it, and then it says Food Inc. on it. And right next to it are two barrels that have the hazardous waste symbol on it. And it says, start here to the left of it with an arrow that points at a dinosaur being hunted by four cavemen.
Stop. That's insane.
I'm 100% serious. No, I'm going to crop this just so you can see it, so that people know that I'm not just being a D-bag about this.
Yeah.
Because this is real.
Yeah.
Like, this is the stuff that is at the front desk of of some of the boxes I've been to, and I was like, oh, I see what's happening. You know, like this is perhaps negatively influencing people.
Yeah. People that weren't there at the time. This is what occurred. Like I went to probably like over a dozen CrossFit gyms. So I'm not, it was a little bit of an indoctrination because they were told by higher, now we're going to get a cease and desist by CrossFit, but we're ready, bro. We're ready.
So I'll let the people on YouTube look at this. This is the top of what is here. It says, start here. Again, dinosaur being hunted by cavemen. And then it says not here, which is slightly cut off, but you can tell that it says that smokestacks at a factory labeled Food Inc. And I was not kidding, biohazard barrels next to it. This is real stuff, folks. So, and then below that, it's like, what should your plate look like?
Right.
And it's, for some reason, just vegetables and meat, nothing else. Yep. And like carrots, like, which is still a vegetable anyway. So yeah, it's just, maybe not factually accurate is the best way to put it. But yeah, the composition of your diet, I don't think it matters quite as much for obviously symptoms of overtraining or REDs, but at least for lifters. I'm not confident in saying that, if you eat like a low carb, high fat diet as a triathlete, that you're going to experience symptoms of REDs. I am reasonably confident that most people who do that will see a reduction in performance though. Like if your energy expenditure goes up from high intensity aerobic activity, and then your main fuel source for that goes down, it doesn't go well. Like we have a lot of experimental trials where that is the case. That's not to say that there aren't some individuals who can thrive as an endurance athlete after an adaptation period with a lower than traditionally recommended carbohydrate intake. But most research would suggest if you're an endurance athlete, you want a lot of carbohydrates on board. So yeah, there is actually some data. Again, how much it applies to resistance trained athletes who train like 20% of this at most, probably not a huge deal as long as you're getting in like 2 grams per kilo or like 1 gram per pound of carbohydrate per day or more, and a sufficient energy intake is probably not going to be an issue. That's kind of my general recommendation. But I do think for people who are doing concurrent training, team sport athletes who lift, endurance athletes who lift, people who are strong men or women or CrossFit competitors who have a lot of energy expenditure and multiple different energy systems at play, this could result in some effects of overtraining, basically declines in performance that really just come down to you have a preferred fuel source that you are not providing in a sufficient amount, and that's decreasing your certain types of performance for sure.
Eric, so we spoke about now this low energy availability, where it's been observed, those mythical, once again, endurance athletes. We spoke about our paleo ancestors hunting, dinosaurs, the Tyrannosaurus rex, and some such thing to provide sustenance for their family. So we know Jurassic Park wasn't that far off about anything, and that's sobering. That once again, it's reassuring, right?
Yeah, and we actually found out that from Jurassic Park, you can try to hunt dinosaurs with spears.
Yeah.
But the velociraptors will get you even if you got shotguns and jeeps. All right. And the only
that's
thing that's going to
OP.
stop the velociraptor is a T-Rex. Okay. Who just is not on your side, but is like a force of nature prevents you from being killed. And you better get on that helicopter and get off that island. Okay.
Yeah.
And go back to Food Inc. And you know what? You eat those toxic burritos. Because if you don't eat those toxic burritos, you're going to be a burrito for a velociraptor.
Bro, yeah. The Tyrannosaurus Rex, or Flex, as we like to say around here, is like a primeval force that's above morality. So it's like it's above your petty human concerns, but can be used, as you said, like for a force of change, of good, like question mark. Now, Eric, to get back on the topic, because I do want to wrap this up in a neat little bow tie. And I am, thinking just about the lifters, thinking about those dangling between 3 sets and 4 sets of 10, and they hear now low of energy availability. We're basically trying to describe and define what people are experiencing, where their experiences are valid. And I think one of the things you once again crystallized it perfectly is that not in the science community, but amongst, let's say, the strength coaches out there, where they hear overtraining, they know like that's a word, it's incorrect. Like it is an incorrect definition, but people are experiencing these things. So either maybe if they're trying to diet down and then they're also trying to manage their volume, or maybe they're doing a particularly grueling block. And so they're trying to describe what they're experiencing using the wrong terminology. Let's then just wrap it back and bring it full circle for some of these lifters that are feeling some of these things. What are, as a coach, like let's put on Eric's coaching hat. So from researcher now to coach, when someone comes to you, so let's just role play here as we're wont to do. Whoop! Honey, I'm home. I just came home from hunting a brontosaurus, but I'm feeling fatigued. If someone starts describing to you certain sensations or symptoms that seem similar to, let's say, either low energy availability or performance is decreasing, and the time course, if we're trying to define it, it's not session to session, so we're expanding it a little bit beyond that. What are the questions that a coach such as yourself would ask that maybe people then can use as tools to self-diagnose what they're experiencing?
Absolutely. That's a fantastic question. I think that's ultimately what it comes down to, is we don't really need the labels REDS or overtraining syndrome to make better decisions and help people as coaches. And again, it's an exclusionary diagnosis that includes making sure that medical diagnoses are not mistaken for overtraining or REDS. So it's really not our business, not even me, who is read this research and is well versed in it, to make those kind of distinctions. That would be a sports dietitian who's also an RD, or an MD with sports medicine training, athletic trainer, etc., in combination with a multidisciplinary team, talking to the sports coach and the S&C and the nutritionist. So that's where those actual technical terminologies occur. But in the everyday gym, powerlifters, weightlifters, bodybuilders, strongmen and women, casual lifters, and even some endurance athletes who are just doing the damn thing and also lifting, really we care about is, am I plateaued, and what is the cause, right? And there's a lot of things that can result in a plateau. Some things that we could loosely classify under this kind of larger umbrella: non-functional overreaching, mechanical overtraining. As we've talked about previously, just because you are able to do a sufficient amount of volume or a very high amount of volume, and you can recover performance from it and you can accomplish it all, basically we're talking about increasing your recuperability and your work capacity. Those are separate adaptations to strength or hypertrophy. There is no reason necessarily that what you can handle and recover from and accomplish isn't far beyond what would actually be optimal. And this is kind of where that myth of the volume trap is. Like, oh, well, I've been doing too much, but I can handle and recover from and progress doing 30 sets per muscle group. I can't go below that because I'm adapted to it. That's not true. Yeah. You might be progressing at 1/3 of the rate you could doing 20 sets, right? So you cut your volume in 1/3 and you increase progress. That has been observed. That does happen. I've seen it anecdotally many times. You are not beholden to now this level of volume you've done. But a lot of the times, it's not that you're plateaued because you're simply not doing enough, right? There's basically 2 reasons on the training side why you're plateaued, and they're the opposites. You're either doing too much or you're doing too little. And how do we discover that? Because that ultimately comes down to under recovery or under stimulus, right? If it's an under stimulus, it's easy. That's an easy one to figure out. Training doesn't feel hard. You're definitely not experiencing any of these secondary symptoms. And since performance isn't going down, you're probably also not experiencing something like REDS, and you're not, starving yourself or doing it in a really aggressive way. You have enough energy for whatever you're doing. So probably need to do a little more or train a little harder. But there's basically a checklist I go through. So first is, are you plateaued? And again, that's a whole, conversation to have, because like we talked about, people don't have good perspectives on whether they're truly plateaued at certain phases, or maybe they're benchmarked their performance to the best possible day, that the meet they had, that all the stars aligned, rather than what's my average performance. So if we can get an accurate view of, am I plateaued? Then the next steps are, well, all right, is everything else outside of the gym taken care of? Am I eating enough? Am I eating enough protein? Am I making sure I'm not consuming like a really unbalanced diet in terms of macronutrients? Am I getting sufficient sleep? Is my qualitative performance, because we're talking about training stress, which is like a load and volume, but is my actual technique stable enough so I can observe improvements in performance? Am I, if we're talking about hypertrophy, am I using a sufficient range of motion? Am I controlling the eccentric? Is my gauges of proximity to failure accurate, or is my RPE actually way inflated and I think I'm at an 8 and I'm actually at a 4? Because all that stuff can confuse can muddy the waters, if you will. So if we can sort all that, we know we're eating enough, and we know we're eating high enough quality, and we know that our training's on point and that our recovery's on point in terms of sleep and our psychological stress. If that's all good to go and we feel fine in the gym, but we're not progressing, you're probably not doing enough. However, if you fix those things and your training improves, that means it might have been you weren't eating enough, or eating enough protein, or eating enough carbohydrate, or you weren't sleeping enough, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So really what it comes down to is not us necessarily labeling these things, but just figuring out what is a sufficient amount of total training stress to improve. And then if I am, and not far exceeding that, because that can lead to secondary symptoms that don't even necessarily suppress performance. You might be able to progress at the same or even a faster rate, even while you're still progressing, without those negative secondary effects and with a lower risk of injury. And I'm not saying there's like a really strong connection between like total training stress, or especially not total training volume, and injury, but I will tell you this: the way we measure injury rates are in the occurrence per 1,000 hours of training. So if we accept the idea that the amount of total training you do, like training volume, is completely disconnected from injury, then we have to throw out all injury training data we have, where we're actually comparing, oh, look at that, strongman competitors and strongwomen competitors and Highland Games competitors are injured at a rate of, say, on average, 8 to 12 times per 1,000 hours, while it's only a third of that in powerlifters and weightlifters, and in like an eighth of that in bodybuilders. We have to invalidate all of that, which is an actual observation, and I think that's true. It tells you something about maybe the intensity or the diversity of movements or the proximity to failure or the loads or the combination of all the above. So there is obviously some relationship between training stress and injury. It's hard to actually distinctly quantify it. There may be some relationship to what are you accustomed to versus how much you're doing versus the absolute amount. So the relative amount of training stress, but it's there. And I think while we can't necessarily uncover that at the group level or the population level, at the individual level, you can be pretty confident that if you blow up the total amount of training you're doing in a short time period, or the intensity of it, or volume and intensity, if you really just like to go ham, and it's not an graded approach, and especially if you're already progressing quite well and you do it anyway just because you think you can handle it and things go poorly, that could be either overtraining or it could be low energy availability if you didn't commensurately increase your energy intake. But really, it's like a checklist. You need to go through like a flow chart. Plateaued? Yes. Okay. Am I doing all these other things outside of the gym? Yes. Okay. Then I'm plateaued. All right, maybe we try to do a deload. Did that sort it? And I was able to progress for a while. Okay, that's fine. We're just doing functional overreaching, right? And that's an important thing. This doesn't need to be necessarily a systemic chronic reduction in total training volume, right? If you're able to progress for 4 weeks and you plateau for a couple weeks with the same training program, maybe just every 5th week-ish, if you kind of maintain the same training structure, you need a recovery week. And then your performance comes back up and it was better than before, that's fine. You're just taking a functional overreaching approach to your training, which is A-okay. Maybe that those deloads come far less frequent. It's not really that kind of non-functional, or rather functional overreaching approach. It's just kind of your standard training where once a niggle pops up, maybe a specific joint starts to have issues, or you have a vacation, or you just get a little burned out, or you need a change up, you do a deload or something like that. That's fine. That wasn't technically non-functional overreaching. That's just quote unquote normal overloading training. And you're probably going to have phases in your career, depending on your goals and what you're trying to accomplish, where you can do either or need to do one or the other. If you just simply don't have the time to say, go through phases that result in functional overreaching, even though it might theoretically be better. Likewise, there may be time periods where if you want to get bigger and stronger at the same time, you're having to train multiple disciplines, you kind of have to cyclically deload because the amount of overload you're producing to have your cake and quote unquote eat it too. But you also might go through periods where you overshoot a little bit and in your attempt to get those goals, and you non-functionally overreach. But that's probably the worst it's going to get. Unless, of course, you decide to combine non-functional overreaching with not eating enough. And then you can experience what we've talked about that we often observe in contest prep competitors or in certain eras of the CrossFit community, et cetera.
Eric, I love that overtraining, as you said, is an exclusionary diagnosis. So turns out I don't have overtraining. I just have terminal cancer. I had to go through the checklist. I was curious what was going to happen. So that's the good news. We know it's not overtraining. Hey, so
you're like, hold on. I thought it was a bag of worms, and then I realized actually, I shouldn't have 3 testicles. That's a tumor.
Oh boy, I did the check for the bag of worms, and I discovered more than a bag of worms. I discovered a whole new journey. I will say,
an extra bag.
I will say, man, that I do think, for the average lifter, probably the only other thing to keep in mind, one, we spoke about that, the purgatory of being an intermediate, where it's like, am I making progress? Am I not making progress? How do we define that? Like, what is a plateau? Like all those questions, like that in and of itself, to your point, is a conversation. But also, I would say that once you kind of escape, being a student is stressful, like no doubt, I'm not trying to belittle that whatsoever. But I think people over time accumulate more responsibilities, right? Like as we get older. So when you go from an 18-year-old whippersnapper, like I remember this. I don't know if you could relate to this, Eric, that my overall workload, being a student, like I had the normal amount of courses. I worked 40 hours a week. And then my transportation time to the university, I took a bus and it's 75 minutes, so there and back. Like, so
Yep.
my schedule was full, right? Let's just say. But my overall stress, because I'm going to school, I'm enjoying it, I'm working 40 hours, but it actually was very low. Like it was very low. And I think over time, our lives get a little bit more variable, right? Like we get in relationships or commitment, like a wide variety of other, we become responsible for other people. That we just have to keep in mind that on occasion, there might be just a little bit of volatility in our lives, that then we have to match the training to adjust for that. And I would say just quickly for myself personally, that was something, to your point, we said like the 30 sets, like, we got to stay, rock hard, Eric, at 7 a.m. I acclimated to 30 sets. That's who I am. That's what I do. And then when other things happen outside of lifting and you keep that up, and then you're wondering why you have a degradation in performance, and you're just like, oh man, like, what is this? Is this what's going on? And magically, as soon as you reduce a bit of volume, as soon as you basically adjust your training to match where you are and what your goals are and all those other things, that plateau isn't a plateau, but a launching off point. I think it's just something maybe for people as they continue to lift to keep in mind.
And I'll say, in one's attempt to be rock hard at 7 a.m., as you said, through hard training and a strict diet, if you find that you were specifically as a male not rock hard at 7 a.m. consistently, that might indicate maybe a second checklist we could add. Yeah. Not on the official OTS or REDS checklist, but just something to consider. Yeah. As you can see that misalignment with goal and outcome,
Eric, in my defense, my wife did die from a meteor that fell in our house. So I have been traumatized. So I'm no longer rock hard at 7 a.m. But that's a whole other can of worms or bag of worms, depending upon your definition. Yeah.
Yeah, three compartment bag of worms.
Yeah, man.
That's right.
Yeah, it was a radioactive meteor. Everything's tying together perfectly, right? So the gamma rays just annihilated, completely led to where I'm at today. But for you, here's my question, Eric, because I know I want to be aware of the time and of the cult. To wrap this up into a neat little bow tie, to be delivered or not to be delivered for the holidays, because this is yet to be released. what are some other things people have to understand just about the terminology we've been describing, or also just everyone in their lifting journey that maybe might be relatable for the average cult listener?
Yeah, I got some key take homes. So we talked a lot about terminology, and sometimes it may seem like terminology is kind of pointless when we think we're all speaking the same language, at least in a colloquial sense. But you'd be surprised how often that is actually not the case. So do say what you mean what you say, and maybe don't even label it. Don't call it overtraining. Just say, hey, I'm plateaued. Am I doing too much or not enough? Or might there be another cause? And I think that'll clear up some of the conversations. Lastly, I will say that if you are, here's the one thing that we know, like it's probably not overtraining syndrome if you're a lifter, right? We've established that. And the message there is not, okay, shit, let's just do some more because we can take all of the volume. The message is rather, if you're experiencing a chronic plateau in performance, it's not overtraining. So what is it? It could be REDS. It could be that you're trying to stay too shredded for the gram, or too close to your weight class, or you're just trying to stay too lean, and that is resulting in low energy availability. So it is good to know that if you're experiencing what one might think is overtraining syndrome, and we're talking months of declines in performance or a plateau, that, yeah, of course, it could just be that you're not training hard enough, but you'll probably be feeling just fine. That's just like 90% of people in the gym, right? They've been maintaining their intermediate or late stage novice gains for years. They're not asking, am I overtraining? I feel terrible. No, like if you're asking this question, ostensibly, as I'd like to say, you're feeling pretty crappy. Now, if you're feeling crappy and you've been plateaued for months, it's not overtraining syndrome if you're a lifter. At least the probability is extremely low. So it maybe pays to look at your nutrition.
Eric, well said, man. Because I do think the cult is for the lifter. And I like, once again, people's experiences, they're valid and they're asking these genuine questions. And I think the worst, like that's what you joke about, like either the ivory tower or some of the things we see on the gram, where you're just like silencing someone because, they use the incorrect terminology. They're trying to understand it. And I also don't like, lastly, just some of the narratives that I think are just lazy. I think they're like intellectually lazy, where it's like, oh, we're robust, adaptive creatures. Like, yeah, you can handle it. Like you think you're overtraining. You're actually just not pushing yourself, man. Like this sometimes it's all in your head. I'm like, well, I mean, there's lifestyle factors. There's all these things. Like you have no idea. We both don't, because this individual hasn't provided any information, and you're just assuming like carte blanche that like, yeah, man, like you're good. Like basically, it's like pat on the shoulder, you're good, rather than like a prescriptive, complete.
It is true that we're robust, adaptable individuals who are not fragile. But you didn't actually diagnose someone from a one-sentence Instagram comment to know that they actually didn't have an injury or weren't overtraining.
Yeah. So that's one thing I'm always proud of, Eric. I can't wait for everyone to read this article in mass. Is that we're for the lifters, right? Like we're trying, like we're trying to, as you joke for our guest, where Eric is the best unofficial member of the Geek Squad for technical support. Like we're here to work shit out, right? Like you got a question, and we're gonna take it completely authentically, like listening, like, okay, so what does that mean, rather than like, Scott, what a fucking loser, like he just said overtraining. Like his wife died in a meteor shower, like you see that shit, right? Like, yeah, it's real good, man. It's real good. That's sticking, by the way. I'm gonna push it. You know when you try and push something forward, like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. That was great. That or
actually,
like,
you know what? I'm good with this one replacing the baby's one. So I think meteors it is.
Bro, you've been on one. It's been a pleasure to do these episodes, as always. But like recently, also, I think the cult has been hot. So I want to thank you for being on the cult. Where can people find you?
They can find me on the cult.
Damn. When?
Every single Monday.
Okay. And if they want to help out, what can they do, Eric?
Oh man, they can leave a rating and review, but specifically only if it's 5 stars.
Yeah. We're politely suggesting we allow free speech here, so you could say what you want, mean what you say it with your chest. But we will selectively read out, because it's a time constraint. It's not censoring you. It's a time constraint. Well, we're gonna make this a review episode. Come on, that's like episode 200 when we really run out of ideas. So like, come on, be patient. But as Eric said, thank you for everyone listening to another episode of Iron Culture. You go ahead and leave that rating and review, and we'll see you every single Monday in that next episode.